come over and sit with
About 45 minutes to work with.
Good afternoon, friends. I can only imagine the emotion present in this room. And it is wonderful to share even difficult and sad events with members of one's community. So on behalf of Frank's family, I offer our gratitude to all who have come here today, from nearby and from far away. And you'll hear some of those voices later on. Before we begin our memorial today, remembering Frank, I wanted to ask everyone a couple of things. First of all, if you have a mobile phone, to make sure it is silenced. You don't need to turn it off, but we do appreciate you just turning the bells and the ringers off and notifications off. They'll be waiting for us, all those calls and the messages, you know, they'll be there. Most of the time, our phones don't lose a trick, so do that. The other thing I would also want to ask you is, I see there are people wearing masks here in the room, and that's perfectly understandable and okay. We each have a different level of sensibility or sensitivity these days to COVID, proximity or not proximity, depending upon one's point of view. And so please, just asking people to be as respectful as you can be regarding that, in addition to the fact that we all want to hug one another, because we haven't seen one another perhaps in very long times. So you have to mediate between all of that. But just be sensitive to the people around you. And of course, if they're part of your family and you know them, that doesn't apply necessarily. But again, we are so glad to be with one another here. Our memorial this afternoon begins with Psalm 121.
As we gather in this space of memory and mourning and consolation, a song of ascending and a song for those who raise each other up. Sheila ma'alot, esa enai el heharim, me'ayin yavo ezri, ezri me'im Adonai, ose shamayim va'aretz, Alitei lamot raglecha, al yanum shomrecha, hine lo yanum velo ishan, shomer Yisrael, Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha, Al yad yeminecha, yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, ve'yareach balayla. Adonai yishmorcha mikora, yishmor et nafshecha, Adonai yishmor tzeitcha uvoecha me'ata ve'ad olam, me'ata ve'ad olam. Song of ascending, I lift my eyes toward the mountains. Where will my help come from? My help is from the eternal maker of heaven and earth. The eternal will not let your foot stumble. Your guardian does not slumber. See, the one who watches over Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. The eternal is your guardian, your shade at your right hand. By day the sun will not strike you, nor the moon by night. The eternal will guard you from all harm, guarding your life, guarding your going and your coming, now and forevermore.
Shalom and good afternoon. Frank Tuerkheimer always had wisdom to impart. and that is, even with me, his Wisconsin rabbi. And I suspect he had similar things to offer to his New York clergy as well, because it was Frank's brilliant and humble and intuitive nature to start communication with people, to open his heart, to exude optimism and joy and hope. And all of that and even more are the things that we are here to talk about this afternoon. In our hearts, there is certainly sadness. And as Barbara and Deborah and Dylan and Alan and Lisa and Jacob and Lizzie and Leo and Max, and I met Michael and other close family and far family and friends and colleagues and teachers and students who are here today, as you all will confirm that this is a difficult moment, because none of us could probably anticipate that we'd see this time as soon as we did. However, what makes these moments meaningful, I think, is trying to figure out and trying to be part of Frank's indomitable spirit. And he's bequeathed, I think, part of that to us. And that's what brings us here. Along with the broad embrace of his family and friends, I think it was his attitude toward life, toward the American values of the legal process and the rule of law, and helping individuals, especially students under his tutelage, that also inspires us to imitate him and pursue his goals. In remembering Frank, we recall his joy, his integrity, his optimism, and the love he shared with his family and with his friends, with you all who are here today. The spirit that he implants in our hearts will continue to preserve us even when we feel grief, even when we feel sadness. And that's a message I really want to stress today as well. That we are sad, and yet in remembering the values that he possessed and the values that he transmits to us, that's probably one of the most important things that we have on this day. Frank's love, I think, united us in life, and death cannot sever that love. For his companionship along life's path, which continues through the tenderness of memory, and for the gifts of his heart and mind that bring us joy and happiness, and now are precious remembrances, for all these we are offering gratitude to the source of life in the world, the source of life that was within him and is still within us. In this time of sadness, we listen to, for a few moments, of the words of sacred scripture that bring us the ever-new message of God's nearness. It tells us of our kinship with not just the Creator, but with all creations, in light as in darkness, and in joy as in sorrow, in life as in death. These words are from Psalm 15, and I think you may hear part of Frank in these words. This is a psalm of David. Eternal God, who may live in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? The answer: they who live without blame, who do what is right, whose hearts acknowledge the truth, whose tongues are not given to evil, who have never done harm to others or borne reproach for their neighbors, for whom cruelty is repugnant, but who honor those who fear God, who stand by their oaths even to their detriment. Those who have never lent money at interest or accepted a bribe against the innocent. Those who live in this way, concludes the psalm, will never be shaken. We now turn to the words of the third chapter of Ecclesiastes, which was one of Frank's important, I think, favorite parts of the Hebrew Bible.
L'kol zman veit lechol chayfetz tachat hashamayim. L'kol zman veit lechol chayfetz tachat hashamayim. Eit laledet ve'eit lamut, eit latat ועת לעקור נטוע, עת להרוג ועת לרפוא, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות, לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים. לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים. A time for birth and a time for death. A time to plant and a time to uproot the planted. A time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear and a time to build. לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים.
The author of these words reminds us that hope, that meaning of life is not necessarily found in thoughts of tomorrow and hopes, which are important, but rather in grateful celebration and acceptance of what life offers us. And some of these words, again, were familiar to you. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to shun embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to rupture and a time to sew together, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for bringing peace. This afternoon, we're going to hear from a number of people who are helping us remember Frank. And so their words are exceedingly important for a number of reasons. One, because it allows them to express how they are feeling on this day. We have members of Frank's family and his students and teachers who are here today to offer these great words for us. It is a time to share memories, and even when some of those memories will bring tears, it is a time to, again, keep in mind the values that is imparted to us and that is part of those memories. But further, this is both for members of Frank's family who are here with us, thankfully, today, and for all of you. Sharing of memories at a time of a funeral is important because you all, I'm thinking now people who are outside of Frank's family, you all have memories that Frank's family doesn't have. And the more that when you share those memories about Frank and you bring in a personal anecdote or you bring in an experience that really is part of who you are in companionship with Frank, that allows Frank's family even to grow and feel good and build in their own mind their love for Frank. And it really goes both ways. So please don't hold back and be sure to share memories with Frank's family and afterwards we'll have a time for this, interconnecting out here in the community court when our services are done today. So when I first came to Temple Beth El, it was now 18 years ago or so, and we were arranging for all of those who were going to volunteer to participate in our High Holy Day worship. We have a lot of volunteer involvement for those who aren't familiar with what we do at the Jewish New Year. Our cantor emerita, Debbie Martin, told me that Frank was one of the go-to presenters on that day. Why? Because he loved chanting the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah is a book that we read on Yom Kippur afternoon. It is one of the books from the Hebrew prophets, And as I reflect back on Frank's chanting in Hebrew, that selection during that first High Holy Day season of mine more than 18 years ago now, I recall being drawn in to his melodic voice and his attraction to Jewish tradition that leads us to hear those words and the admonitions of that prophet who is a reluctant prophet, for those of you who don't know much about Jonah. I'm struck today, perhaps, by how like Jonah was Frank and how unlike Jonah was Frank. Unlike Jonah, who tried to evade his prophetic responsibility, Frank was unflappable and courageous. He seized the opportunity to lead, to identify, to gently but assertively offer his insight, and to bring people around to his way of thinking. In Frank's teaching, in his career, in his life, Frank seemed to find the truth, and he burrowed into it. And the results of such investigation and exploration were always positive, not just for him or his family, but it was positive for us as Americans, dare I say, as even humanity. From what I can see within his family, he was the consummate family leader. He enjoyed biking, so did I, for a while. Sailing, reading, and spending time with family and friends, traveling with his family, spending loving time with Barbara, loving his Jewish connections, extending himself to all. All of these were part of Frank's persona and his essence. And perhaps like Jonah, Frank fought back against injustice and authoritarianism all of his life. He knew that his vision of life, and in his case, the law, was correct and worth protecting. And he did so with a firmness and resolve that gave life and meaning to those around him and shown to us all as a vivid and clear example of how we should be seeing things. Frank was exceedingly proud of his children and his grandchildren, of their lives, of their accomplishments, of who they are turning out to be as people, and of their love for one another as well. His extended family will come to share some of their reactions in a few moments, as I mentioned to you earlier. But even from his mouth to his rabbi's sensibilities, I gained an appreciation of his pride and his joy of how his family members use their strengths for always good purposes. For his own comfort, that is, living here in the Midwest, he came to enjoy both his numerous professional responsibilities in Madison and in New York, and always looked to both as places of joy and inspiration. In New York, where his family roots in a deep familiarity with life, as well as the rough and tumble activity of life there, he came to love that city so much. And life here in Madison, he enjoyed as well, the relaxed nature of sitting in a screened-in porch, talking with his friends and his beloved Barbara, being with his family here, his loving nature, and going to the symphony to hear grand music. He also was duly proud of his German Jewish heritage, descending from a Jewish liberal perspective. His family was able to get out of Germany on the last few boats that were able to leave the country right before the gates were closed to Jewish emigration. And so he became absolutely dedicated to the memory of those victims of the Holocaust, publishing later in his life a book documenting what he and Michael Baslier called the forgotten trials of the Holocaust. Barbara mentioned to me that Frank shared his wisdom in many ways, but one was through simple and clear, wise sayings. Perhaps at this tender moment, Barbara, the one that you shared with me I think is the most poignant. And that is, you can't rue the passage of time. You can only rue not using your time well. Frank was someone who taught us to use life well and appropriately, to make the skills we possess as useful to humanity as possible, and not to regret overmuch if we make mistakes along the way. I think he would want us to be self-analytical, for from there we grow. But I think he would say that if we spend too much time reviewing the past or bemoaning an inappropriate action, we may dwell on our past to our future's detriment. At times of grief, it is not too much to remember and smile, even though we will remember and cry, and admit to the longing of the heart, because all of that, friends, makes us human. And today, we begin our own very human response to our loss, that's for sure, and to our pathway forward, but with naught but memories accompanying us. And that requires strength. And the strength that it takes to move forward with the memories is the strength that each of us gains from one another. So always remember that when you are with someone who knew Frank and you want to share a memory, you gain strength from one another, again, by your telling a memory, by their telling you a memory, and by your remembering Frank in that way. Let us recall all of this as well when we set our minds and hearts to the task of preserving and enshrining our memories. Frank as a teacher, Frank as a parent, a grandparent, Frank as a cousin, Frank as a friend, Frank as a student, Frank again as a teacher, Frank as someone whom we knew in this community. We are all so privileged to have known him. We have a number of people to share some views with us this afternoon, and first I'm privileged to invite Frank's daughter, Deborah, to join us, please.
Well, along with my brother, our families, and especially my mom, I want to thank all of you for being here, whether in the room or joining us from afar, and for the outpouring of support through these past weeks. It truly is a comfort. Those who know me know I adored my dad. From earliest childhood, he was the very best father, and my relationship with him has been an endless source of strength, joy, and gratitude. This total adoration has always been paired equally with admiration of his values and how he lived those values every day. Because I can't possibly put words to my adoration of or love for my dad, I want to speak to what I most admired, and that is how he filled his life with meaning. My dad felt an abiding connection to the past. He understood himself as the product of earlier generations who lived and died even before his parents escaped Nazi Germany to begin anew in Washington Heights, a neighborhood in northern Manhattan. This acute awareness of being one link in an ancestral chain is also a reason that Judaism was very important to my dad. And more than anyone I know, he was able to integrate the past and the present into a coherent, secure sense of self. Perhaps this is why, in his own quiet way, he was the most charismatic person in the room, the least pretentious, sometimes the most blunt, and without fail, the one with the greatest perspective. My dad was profoundly curious about the world, and by this I mean the world of ideas and the natural world alike. My dad marveled at just about everything. I picture him always reading the widest range of books, Smithsonian Magazine, National Geographic, even my own long and not at all cheery law review articles. Without fail, he devoured the daily newspaper and the nightly news. He traveled to all parts of the world, including Swaziland as a young man, an unconventional honeymoon to Morocco, family vacations to Australia and Europe, a solo excursion to Antarctica, and along with his very fortunate college graduate daughter, a trek in the Himalayan region of Nepal. My dad felt both awed by and at home in nature. If you ever saw him biking, you saw a happy man. If you were lucky enough to join him on a bike ride, as I was on countless occasions over more than 5 decades, beginning as a toddler on the back of his bike, you undoubtedly shared this happiness. He loved his rides out west from Madison to the countryside, where he would often stop and pet the donkeys, fully absorbed in communing with these very gentle creatures. He also loved sailing on his little boat on Lake Mendota. All this could be and often was combined. So a bike ride to a sail was the definition of a perfect summer day, especially when the excursion included a stop at the Union for ice cream. Mocha macchiato. And he loved the night sky, not only because he was fascinated by what he learned about astronomy, but because the night sky is beautiful and it reminds us that we're all part of an unfathomably large and mysterious universe. My dad saw beauty in cities too, New York City in particular. From boyhood and through his life, he was captivated by the subways, their maps, their workings. He also loved the energy of the city, the diversity of its people, the range of raw humanity on display. He regularly biked in New York, and not just in Central Park. A favorite route, the aptly named Jersey L, took him across the George Washington Bridge in a ride that I think seamlessly and joyfully connected present and past for him. Music did much the same for my dad. Classical works and opera transported him. And because he listened throughout his life to certain pieces of music, and music that long predated him, it served as a sublime marker of continuity, longevity, and the prospect of a kind of immortality. Among others, Dvorak's New World Symphony was this for my dad, who would always close his eyes and listen enraptured. My dad left the world a better place than he found it. He did this humbly, without ego, authentically, and without fanfare, through his kindness to strangers and people he barely knew. He did this by teaching and mentoring students who would go on to use their law degrees for good. As a child sitting in the back of his evidence classroom, and then as a young adult, I saw my dad educate a next generation of ethical, competent lawyers, many who would go on to serve the public interest in one way or another. My dad viewed this work as a sort of force multiplier, which resonated with me. And yes, I became a law professor, teaching evidence, no less. Others here will speak to my dad's work in prosecution, but I will say this. I watched throughout my childhood as my dad pursued justice in different forms. To him, justice meant that no one is above the law, and those who have little power in our society should be represented by people who care genuinely and passionately about their interests. So no, it is probably not a coincidence that when I graduated from law school, I went to work as a domestic violence prosecutor in New York. Reflecting on a life so well and wisely lived, it strikes me that as much as is humanly possible, my dad was able to avoid getting mired in the muck of the frivolous, the petty, the unimportant. He found his happiness in the good, the simple, the essential. Nowhere is this more apparent than in my dad's love for his family, his siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, nephews, niece, and of course his kids and grandkids. But above all, my dad considered himself the luckiest man for having met and married his soulmate. My mom was his best friend, his partner, through the mostly happiest of times, but also through the tough ones. His true companion in a lifetime of sunsets, adventures, laughter, poems, and shared purpose. Theirs was a paragon of marriage, and for it, he was grateful beyond words every single day. For the past 18 years, my dad was also a grandparent. And as many of you know, he embraced this identity, this role, with his characteristic zest. I'm sure many of you heard stories about his grandkids. All four brought my dad infinite pride and infinite joy. Max and Leo, Jacob and Lizzie. You, of course, want more time with him, but I can say this with total certainty. Granddad took the fullest advantage of his years with you. He would have it no other way. And he will forever live on in each of you through the stories he told you, the wisdom he imparted to you, and all the fun he had with you. This seems like the right place to close. As the rabbi mentioned, my dad believed and often said that we should never rue the passage of time. We should only rue not using time well. What I think of as his way of operationalizing the idea that for everything there is a season. My dad lived this philosophy daily with the greatest of gusto, which made his existence not only happy beyond measure, but every bit as meaningful. The goodness of my dad's life will forever guide me and the choices I make, and he did much the same for those whose lives he touched. His memory is truly and uniquely a blessing.
And now I'd like to invite to the bima Alan and Lisa and Jacob and Lizzie. Please join us. You have to work around with the microphone. Let me pull that a little bit closer. Thank you. Sure. Here we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I really liked being around Granddad. I liked having catch with him and watching baseball. I liked how he laughed. I miss him a lot. I love him so much.
I liked Granddad's stories and being with him. He made me feel good. He did huppahs on his lap. I loved him.
I'm Lisa Weiss. I'm Frank's daughter-in-law. Frank held so many meaningful roles, as you'll hear about from so many people today. But with us, he was Granddad. He was the most loving, devoted, kind, and wise grandfather. Frank and Barbara always made time for their grandchildren. Every visit we shared in Evanston, New York, and Madison was special and memorable. Not just because of what we did, and we did so many special things together, but because of the way Frank and Barbara focused their attention on our kids, how together they made our children feel important, loved, and respected. Frank would take first Max and Leo and then Jacob and Lizzie onto his lap, and he sang the German nursery rhyme they loved so much. Lizzie referred to it, Huppe, Huppe, Rider, translated as bumpity, bumpy rider, pretending to be a horse. At the end, he pretended the child would fall, and then he'd catch them. Whenever Barbara and Frank couldn't be with us in person, Frank and Barbara spent hours on Zoom playing chess with our children, watching Jacob make baskets and a hoop in his bedroom, listening to Lizzie crack jokes, sharing tales from kindergarten class, and they truly made the most of every moment together. And every day as I watch and experience what a wonderful and loving father Elin is, and also watching Deb, what a wonderful mother you are, I see how much Frank imparted upon his children. He showed that it was possible to somehow, miraculously and seamlessly weave together professional and family life. Frank was practically superhuman in every way. I remember a time when Frank and Barbara led a walk from 68th Street to Union Square with all of us in New York City. It was more than 100 blocks. Afterwards, I was so exhausted, I went back to their apartment and threw up in the bathroom. In my defense, I was postpartum, but Frank was 76 years old, and he didn't even need to sit down. I'll never forget how beautifully Frank spoke about his love for Barbara at her 74th birthday party. It was an intimate dinner at a seafood restaurant. His admiration for her, her career, her life, their life together, and the family they built together. It was so powerful. And I saw it in every interaction. We will all miss Frank terribly, his remarkable, intelligent, knowing smile. And I know his memory will forever be a blessing.
Some of you had the joy and experience hearing my dad at a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a birthday where he would work on and then recite a poem that had verses that rhymed. And we always looked forward to that. It was really nice, so I thought that's what I would do here today. Looking back upon my childhood, you always had time to spend with family and friends. You were involved with so many things in your life, but felt that being a father transcends. You were consistently so interested in and a part of what was happening in my world. From the big picture milestones to the daily activities, you were there as it all unfurled. We had catches, rode bikes, swam at Parkrest and Lake Marone, always with big smiles. And I never once felt that our time together was less than or even on par with any of your trials. You always had time to shoot baskets or toss a football or even play some Atari. And your down-to-earth ways and love of the outdoors conveyed that a bicycle was more sensible than a Ferrari. The green bike of yours should find its way into some cycling hall of fame. You never raced, sped, wanted to compete, or sought any type of acclaim. You just love being outdoors in the world, pedaling from point A to point B and back to A. In Wisconsin, it was around farmland, and in New York City along the Henry Hudson Parkway. Your love for the outdoors was never limited to one season. You taught me to ski and often took us skiing. You never understood why cold winter months typically had people fleeing. Madisonians may recall the Statue of Liberty's head and torch on frozen Lake Mendota, where you and I every winter it was there would start to walk across. You even, to not make us feel left out on Christmas time, rang our doorbell dressed up as Santa Claus. I have lasting images of you visiting me at various places wherever I was. You stopped in to say hello during camps, in my dorm room at work, or just because. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention something about stickball, the perfect blend of a game played on the streets of New York, but up against a huge brick wall. On Sundays, we would grab Hudson and play for hours in the summer morning sun. You were the 1953 Yankees, and when facing Whitey Ford, I was lucky to score even a run. With so many accomplishments and all your success, and a personality that can be described as sunny, we cannot forget or overlook how you were also tremendously funny. From extensive, fully planned, practical jokes to a clever, unrehearsed remark, you made so many of us laugh. even when or especially when the clever antic was directed at a loved one's behalf. On our trip to Mount Rushmore 25 years ago, you gave me quite a funny scare when you abruptly rolled down my car window and right outside was a massive black bear. Good thing, Mom, you weren't there. And none of this would be complete if there was no mention of the sailboat. Anyone and everyone was welcome, friends, family, acquaintances, and those more remote. You love nothing more than to take a sail on a calm afternoon with the sun on full display. You packed so much into every day that anchoring the boat and jumping in was just another breathtaking day. With time, you fully embraced the role of being special granddad to 4 grandchildren, 2 of Deb's and 2 of mine. Mine perhaps came as some relief. You did so many wonderful things with all of them, and they loved you beyond belief. In 2017, the totality bug, also known as the total solar eclipse, hit, and we hopped on a train to southern Illinois. We arrived at midnight. There were no hotel rooms available, so at age 78, you were content to sleep on the floor in a random hostel. Of sleep we were devoid. Your optimism never waned since we very recently talked about it, and you swore that you look forward to seeing the next total eclipse in April of 2024. Even in the last few years, it was clear your sense of adventure and optimism continued on, and would always be keenly felt. So many of your remarkable traits and memories will remain entirely heartfelt. I still to this day cannot fall asleep without saying the prayers you taught me when I was a young boy. Your wisdom, kindness, and spirit of living a full life will always give me strength and joy. It was fitting, in more ways than I can know, your final day was on Rosh Hashanah, a day that we deeply revere, the Jewish holiday where we ask God for forgiveness for things we've done wrong during the past year. Now, on every Rosh Hashanah, when loved ones say your yahrzeit with apples and honey to eat, we will think about you as inspiration and how you lived a life that was in every way complete.
I'd like to invite Susan Isaacs to the bema, someone with a very special connection to both Frank and Barbara.
Barbara, Deb, Alan, and beloved grandchildren. Just want to remember Frank. In the summer of 1967, I'd had 3 dates with Elin Abramowitz, but then he said goodbye. He was headed west with Frank Tuerkheimer, a law school friend and Southern District of New York colleague and fellow outdoorsman. Elkin viewed himself in that last category because of overnights under the stars at Camp Chippewa. Elkin was away for about 3 weeks. Back then, long-distance calls were considered a promising sign in a budding relationship. However, it was clear that Elkin was not pining for me. He offered up too many synonyms for fun, and alas, sounded exuberant. I wanted him to have a good time. I was hoping he'd think well of nature, but it would have been more reassuring if he sounded at least a bit forlorn. It wasn't until after their return that I met Frank. I was impressed, in part because of Frank's intellect and the breadth of his interests. I was then 23 and associate editor at 17 magazine, moonlighting as a political speechwriter. I'd been around the block 2 or 3 times. I knew people who were passionate about classical music and obscure sports and modern European history. But I'd never met anyone so taken with Alaskan fishing rights. In the months as my relationship with Elkin deepened, I got to know Frank better. Unlike some of the other assistants in the U.S. Attorney's Criminal Division, guys who argued for a living, Frank didn't cut off a woman when she was expressing an opinion. And there was none of that flaring of nostrils that signal woman talking, suppress yawn. Frank Tuerkheimer did not seem to condescend to women or indeed to anyone. So naturally I said to Elkin, we've got to fix him up with Barbara. My best friend Barbara Wolfson had been a year behind me at Queens College, but was way ahead of me when it came to academics and self-confidence. We had much more than mere outer borough closeness. 2 years before, we'd spent a summer seeing Europe on $5 a day. If you're thinking no one actually did that, you haven't had Barbara pry you out of a third-class pension where at least you had a roof over your head, push you from one to another line of the Madrid metro in order to reach the unshaded side of a bullfight ring on a day when the temperature hit 3 digits. Oh, and have her suggest, don't think in Fahrenheit. Bullfighting was then part of the culture of Spain, and Barbara was a great companion throughout all the countries we visited because she was in love with culture and all the arts, as well as with good talk. Not only did we talk ourselves into near exhaustion, but she was a human icebreaker, able to start a conversation with even the most tight-lipped person in Paris who happened to be sitting at a table next to ours in a cafe. That next year when I was working and Barbara was getting her master's in medieval Spanish literature at Columbia, we shared an apartment on 78th Street with 2 other women who kept strange hours that were never explained. So it was pretty much the 2 of us. It was wonderful. I didn't really have to sell Elkin on the idea of Barbara being a natural for Frank, though I did seal the deal by telling him Frank can be a little intimidating when he's explaining why you're wrong. I explained that Frank was not only a gifted arguer, he was a born logician who could find a flaw in your thinking within nanoseconds after you uttered what you assumed was a well-thought-out opinion. But Barbara being intimidated by intellect? Nah. And listen, they both had a sense of fun. Ask him if he'd be interested. So Elkin said, he's on trial. I said, fine, then right after the verdict. I can't recall whether Frank said yes immediately, but Elkin is forever persistent and persuasive. Barbara was another story. She said, let me think about it, and then I'm not really comfortable with blind dates. And finally she fell back, and I have a thesis to write. So I said, oh, come on, Barbara, 1 date. He has great blue eyes. They had a beautiful wedding and a beautiful life. Barbara and Frank were a perfect match. What struck me during our weekly Zooms during the COVID years was their mutual intelligence and tenderness. And with all the terror, there was a couple who still had love and still had fun.
And I'd also now like to invite Elin Abramowitz to come and join us as well.
Susan is always a tough act to follow. Frank Tuerkheimer was my friend for just shy of 60 years. We were destined to become friends from the moment we met. He was a year ahead of me, with almost the same educational background. We both went to special New York City high schools, Frank to Bronx Science, me to Brooklyn Tech. We both graduated from Ivy League colleges, both went to NYU Law School. And we both clerked for federal district court judges, and we both became assistant United States attorneys in the mid-60s. And it was there that we met and became fast friends. It was there also that I learned that not only was Frank a year ahead of me educationally, he was steps ahead of me in almost every other respect. Not only was he brilliant, he was creative. Excuse me. Not only hardworking, but fun-loving. Not only serious, but humorous, soft-spoken, yet forceful. As one of my mentors in the U.S. Attorney's Office, he taught me about meticulous and tireless preparation in every respect of our work: investigations, trials, and appeals. His judgment was impeccable, his writing was lucid, his arguments persuasive. Having learned so much from him about the necessity of preparation, you can imagine what I expected from him when it turned out to be our last summer as bachelors. More on that in a minute, and you've heard the conclusion of that. He suggested that we go on a 3-week camping trip through several national parks out west and in Canada. You know, instead of a detailed list of what equipment I needed to bring, he said, bring a sleeping bag and a toothbrush. Instead of a detailed itinerary with reservations at campsites, he said, don't worry. And when my pampered and cautious self asked where would he sleep if it rained, he said, we'll play it by ear. Words he never uttered to me when telling me how to prepare a witness. Play it by ear. So off we went with one-way tickets to Salt Lake City, and our only plan was to rent a car and drive north and west and come home 3 weeks later. 7 parks and nearly 3,000 miles later, and having encountered no rain and the most spectacular scenery I had and have ever since experienced, we flew home from Los Angeles, tired and exhilarated, but closer friends than ever. I mentioned that Frank was soft-spoken, and yet very forceful. Well, that wasn't only in the courtroom or the classroom. He brought that talent to a campsite as well. And one of Alan's lines will resonate with this story, which happened years earlier on. One night in Mount Rainier National Park, as we were both sleeping on the ground near a picnic table, we were approached by a rather large bear, snorting and sniffing, looking for something to eat. Convinced I was going to be its main dish, and Frank its dessert, I skirted out of the sleeping bag to hide under the picnic table, attempting to pull Frank with me, but he would have none of it. Instead of hiding with me, he stood up and confronted the bear. My fingernails are still in that picnic table. The next thing I heard was Frank's dulcet tones, calmly and softly sweet-talking the bear, speaking English and German and singing and trying to convince the bear, in whatever language he was using, that we weren't as delicious as it might have thought. And fortunately for the two of us, much like his success with jurors and students, his argument prevailed, and the bear moved on. Now, after this trip, my future wife, Susan, met Frank and suggested, as she told you, that we fix her up with her best friend, Barbara. and you know the rest. Within a year, the four of us participated in each other's weddings, and we ended up living in the same apartment building. Susan and me in 6A, Frank and Barbara in 10A. We lived on J Street in Brooklyn, a convenient neighborhood that permitted both Frank and I to walk to and from work on many days, right over the Brooklyn Bridge to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Especially after our camping trip, Frank talked more and more about leaving New York to live closer to the wide open spaces that he loved so much. He spent a significant amount of time in Africa, assisting the government of Swaziland in writing and adopting its written constitution, and often said, much to Barbara's chagrin, that he really wanted to move to and practice law in Alaska. That they settled on Wisconsin is a tribute to Barbara's persuasiveness and their desire to stay a little closer to their East Coast friends. Obviously, we didn't see each other as often after their move, but we did stay in touch over the years. And as is true with real and lasting friendships, when we did get together, even if several years had gone by, it was as if we had just seen each other the other week, a week before. Now, there aren't many good things that could be said about the pandemic that upended all our lives. But ironically, it brought Barbara and Frank back into our lives on a regular basis. The four of us had a regular Tuesday night Zoom for 3 years, and you could count on one hand the amount of weeks we skipped. The topics we covered ranged from pure gossip to current events to reminiscences of the good old days. Of course, in the last year or so, we shared the ups and downs of Frank's medical struggle. What was remarkable to Susan and me was the consistent strength of spirit he displayed as he went through all those ups and downs. There was no hint of self-pity or of giving in. He retained his intellectual passions along with his remarkable sense of humor until the end. So to Barbara, Deborah, Elin, and your families, I know and I share the gaping hole his death has brought to our lives. But I know that the strong memories we share of such an extraordinary man will remain with us the rest of our lives. May his memory be a blessing.
We invite Mark Nordenberg to the bema, please.
Good afternoon. Because I responded so promptly to the rabbi's invitation, you already know that my name is Mark Nordenberg. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin School of Law in 1973. And for those 3 years of law school, I learned from and worked with Frank Tuerkheimer. I've spent the bulk of my own career at the University of Pittsburgh as a law professor, as dean of the law school, and for nearly 20 years as chancellor of the university. One clear measure of the very large debt that I owe to Frank is that I never would have imagined an academic career for myself except for my associations with him. But I want to make clear that Frank's influence on me and on countless other students who will not have the opportunity to speak today went far beyond that. He not only helped us envision satisfying paths through life, but he equipped us to travel those paths successfully and happily. And so the associations that I claim most proudly and gratefully today are that Frank was my teacher, that Frank became an important mentor, and that Frank and Barbara became good, close, loyal friends for many, many years. And so let me say to you publicly, Barbara, what I have said to you privately. I know what a great loss this is because I feel it myself, and I extend deepest sympathies to you and the members of your family. And if I can underscore a point that every single speaker has made, it always made me feel a little bit better about life when I spent time with you and Frank, because your love for each other was so apparent and uplifting. I can remember the first time that I ever heard anyone utter Frank's name. It was August of 1970. I was an incoming student. I dutifully took my course list down to a room in the basement of the law school to buy my books. The mustachioed upper-class student who was in charge of such transactions gazed at my list and then looked knowingly at me and said, "Tuerkheimer for torts. Ah, the terrible Turk." What I didn't know at that time was that, like me, Frank was brand new to the law school, so there could have been nothing knowing in the gaze that this student passed on to me. I'm sure that he was simply trying to add to the anxiety that is felt by most incoming law students. I'd like to say that his words had no impact on me, but 53 years later, since I can recall that exchange so clearly, perhaps I should let you be the judge. Frank's first class as a law professor was my first class as a law student. It was a small section class, just 20 or 25 of us. And we met every day, 5 days a week for that first semester. Though I don't think Frank ever taught torts again, for me, it was the class that most clearly delivered what a first-year course is supposed to do. It was a master class in reading and thinking and analyzing and persuading. I later would become a teacher myself, of course, with no training, as is true of most professorial positions. But Frank was my model. And what that means is that he not only had a direct influence on the thousands of students he taught himself, but he had a meaningful, though indirect, influence on the thousands of students that I taught myself over the years. Even more important than those things, by the way he conducted himself, Frank began to teach all of us what it meant to be a professional. Those lessons continued for me when, at the end of that first semester, he asked if I would be his research assistant, a position that I held for the next 2.5 years, with assignments that ranged from tromping through fields to collect wastewater samples from dairy farms, to working on briefs to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. The broad lessons that I took about professionalism from Frank have been important in every position that I have held. And because they can be so critical in building reservoirs of respect and forging friendships and leading teams, the lessons that were most important to me have been, take your responsibilities seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. Be demanding, but never be demeaning. And recognize that any work done to advance a noble cause is work of worth. Frank and I never worked together after those 3 years of law school, though he made a couple of approaches to me, which means that his impact on me really came in a very concentrated dose during those 3 years of law school. And from those years forward, I always felt that no matter what I was doing, no matter what challenges I was facing, I was carrying pieces of Frank Tuerkheimer with me. Over the decades, we made the effort to stay in touch and to regularly see each other. Most often that was lunch or a dinner in New York with Barbara. But occasionally our get-togethers took other forms. Exactly 20 years ago, for example, Frank and Barbara were sitting at courtside with me in Madison Square Garden when the Pitt men's basketball team won its first Big East championship and launched what I would say was the golden age of Pitt basketball. I can't prove that there was a causal connection, but Frank was a full-service mentor, and he and Barbara were there. In thinking about it, I also realized that maybe Frank and Barbara would not want to take any credit because exactly a year later, the Panthers bounced the Badgers from the NCAA tournament in a game played in Milwaukee. A few years after that, a reaccreditation team led by John Sexton, then the president of NYU, came to the university. Also traveling with John in that contingent as a senior counselor was Norman Dorson, a giant in law and legal education, someone who had led the ACLU for 15 years and who often is credited for making NYU a destination school for students interested in public service. When he learned about my connection to Frank, Professor Dorson, with a big smile on his face, loudly proclaimed, well, then you're my professional grandson, because Frank is one of my professional sons. And I felt really humbled to be made a part of that distinguished lineage. One of my favorite quotes consists of words written by Henry Adams over a century ago. A teacher affects eternity. He can never tell where his influence stops. Recognizing that there was no way Frank possibly could know the impact he'd had on me, I tried to make certain that I told him every chance I could get. And I was particularly glad that I had one last chance last spring when I joined Frank and Barbara for a sidewalk dinner in New York while I was on my way to Asia. He was undergoing chemotherapy at that time, but he looked great. He looked as if he could have just stepped off of a bicycle, and we had a wonderful time. It has been said that those we love don't go away. They walk beside us every day. In my case, the lessons that Frank taught and the standards that he set have been traveling with me for the last 50 years, even when we were separated by great distances. Very recently, I had a strong sense of his presence, even though his passing had separated us in a far more serious way. 5 years ago, in the wake of the most deadly anti-Semitic attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, I became very involved in a wide range of anti-hate initiatives. Perhaps the most special of them was spurred by a call from one of my former students, who considers me to be her special mentor, in the language of Professor Dorson, then perhaps one of Frank's professional granddaughters. She had held a succession of leadership positions in a major international firm, and at that time and currently served as global partner in charge of its global community service initiatives. And her message to me was short and direct. Mark, we need to make sure that Pittsburgh is better remembered for the way that it responded to this hate-fueled attack, and isn't just remembered as the site of another one of these tragedies. And what we've got to do is we've got to create the biggest and best anti-hate conference in the world and have it here in Pittsburgh every year. Well, 10 days ago, we offered the third annual Eradicate Hate Global Summit. It attracted more than 1,000 people in person. It involved 300 speakers and working group members from all around the world. Our initiatives now range from a partnership with the United Nations to use the power of sport to fight hate, to high school summits where we use the power of film to do the same thing. I gave my co-chair a copy of Frank's book, the book to which the rabbi referred, The Forgotten Trials of the Holocaust, and told her that I was dedicating my share of the summit to Frank. Given his own deep commitments in this area, I could not help but feel that the spirit of Frank was in the rooms, pushing this ambitious mission forward with us. And as his ever grateful student and someone who has tried to live up to his expectations, I also hoped that he would be pleased.
We'd like to invite John Sale to the bema, please.
Barbara, Deb, Alan. So I was about to say that your mom and Frank are like family. That's not right. They are family, and they always will be. I'm a newcomer compared to Susan and Elkin. I think I only know Frank for 54 years. I know you're all thinking, it couldn't be, I'm so young. But I'm glad you laughed at that. But I don't think, and Frank and Barbara traveled a lot. So with the exception of the time they were traveling, I don't think in the last 40, 45 years, I don't think a week went by when Frank and I didn't talk at least once, if not twice. Every single, no matter where we were, no matter where we lived. And much of it was having fun, just having wonderful, wonderful fun and not taking ourselves too seriously. I think the best, let me start from the beginning and sum up a few fun experiences which demonstrate one, I guess just what a wonderful human being Frank was, and in my mind and you guys' hearts always will be. So I started as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. I was very young. I was about as young as they hired. And Frank and Elkin were big shots. And my second day, it was his first, my second day in the office, it was in 1969. I think that's 54 years ago. My boss calls me in and he says, go to so-and-so, he's gonna give you an appellate brief to do, and go to Frank Tuerkheimer. He has an assignment for you. So I was kind of scared. So I go see this guy, Frank Tuerkheimer, and he has all sorts of papers on his desk and message slips, and he says to me, oh, you're the new guy in the office. He said, well, welcome to the office. And he says, I need you to do a memo on, and I didn't understand what he was talking about. I mean, it was so far above my head. And it was about 2 in the afternoon, and he says, but have it by the end of the day. I thought it would take a week. So I stayed till 10 o'clock at night, and I did the best I could. And the next morning, with a little bit of fear in my heart, I went to see him. I handed it to him. He said, okay, I'll call you. And he takes it. The day goes by, he doesn't call me. So I figured, thank goodness, it had to be perfect. Didn't even need an edit. Frank was just going to take it and adopt it, and I was just wondered, would he even give me credit for it or just plagiarize it, basically? So I don't hear a word. 2 or 3 months later, Frank and Elkin left the office, and I don't see or hear from Frank. There's no reason I would. And then fast forward about 5 years, and I am lucky enough to get a job in the Watergate Special Prosecution's office, and I hear that Frank Tuerkheimer, who had gone to Wisconsin, become a law professor, is taking a leave of absence and was going to also be there, and we were going to work together. So I thought, well, you know, it's good to at least have somebody who I hope he has a good recollection of me. I don't know. And I'd never met Barbara, and all I heard about Barbara was she was very accomplished in her own right, and that she was many of you don't know this, she was the senior advisor to Ralph Nader, that she and Ralph Nader, you know, were like this, that Ralph Nader didn't do anything without consulting Barbara, but other than that, so we met, and the first day I had lunch with Frank, and I figured, well, let me see if this guy has a sense of humor. I mean, I didn't know. So Frank, I did some research on Frank, and I saw he had just published an article. And I think maybe, Alan, that's what you were doing some of the research on. And the article is called Copper Mining from Under Lake Superior. So at lunch, I said to Frank, I've read the article, and I couldn't put it down. And I've read it over and over again. And I said, have you thought about going to Hollywood and having a movie made of it? And I said, and maybe you want to go on Johnny Carson, and anybody over the age of 40 knows who Johnny Carson was, and do a book tour. Frank looked at me, and he said, who's Johnny Carson? And I think I said something like, well, he played for the Braves or something like that. But then it turned out that Frank and I worked together, and we worked on the same, on paper, Frank was my boss. But right from the start, we bonded, and we were a team. And we did just about everything together. And we worked on, in Watergate, some really significant historic things. And Frank actually taught a course in Watergate. He invited me out here a couple of times to talk to his class. But that's really all for another time to talk about that. But one or two of the humorous things that I can pick up, because we never take ourselves too seriously. The third person who worked with Frank and me, and I hope he's joining us virtually, is a man named Jim Quarles, who was a wonderful guy who went on to have a distinguished career at Helm, Hale & Dorr, which became Wilmer Hale, a white shoe firm from Boston and Washington. And I don't think Jim Jim actually went on to also work for Bob Mueller. So twice in a lifetime, he had this experience. But I don't think I ever heard Jim say a four-letter word in his life, with one exception. So Jim had come to the office right from a clerkship, and he, did not have a chance to take the bar exam yet. So he was studying for the bar while we were working 60-hour or more weeks, and the Massachusetts bar. And he was going to go up to Boston maybe 2 or 3 days before the exam, take one of these crash courses, and then hope he passed. So Frank and I don't remember who was the mover in this, created a piece of paper that looked like it was written on the letterhead of the Massachusetts Board of Bar Examiners, and an envelope. And we wrote the following, had a secretary type the following. This was 3 days before the exam. Dear applicant, we're writing to notify you of a minor change in the format of the exam. Rather than covering the traditional subjects, torts, contracts, criminal procedure, and all that stuff, we're making a minor change. Instead, we'll be covering bills and notes, future interests, advanced banking law, something like that. And every esoteric thing we could think of, mortgages, and we leave this on Jim's desk. And we stood with it earshot, waiting for him to open it. And he opens the letter and he says, "What? What? Future interests? Bills and notes, what the hell is that?" And anyway, we didn't have the heart, so we went in and we told him. And I could tell you story after story about things that Frank did. But so after we became very close, one day I said to Frank, there's no reason, Frank, you would remember this, but is there any chance 5 years ago, my second day in the office, I did a job for you, a memo, and I never heard from you. I said, is there any chance you'd remember that? He says, of course I remember it, like it was yesterday. So I said, you do? What do you remember? He says, it was the worst piece of blank that I've ever read in my life. So all I said was, thank God you didn't tell me my second day in the office. But it probably was also. So we worked together, we vacationed together. Deb and Alan, Deb, you were like one of my sons. You were perfect. You were an absolutely perfect little child. Alan, I mean, what do I say? A little bit rambunctious? Well, I had the same experience. My youngest son was the same way. I know my youngest son turned out great. I see for today that so did you. But you were a struggle. But that's what parenthood's all about. And on one vacation we took together, and your mom will remind you, I'm sure you do remember, you guys made a very close friend. I don't know if you remember. I'm sure, Barbara, you remember. His name was Mr. Jiggs, and you wanted to take him home with you. He was a big monkey in a big cage. And of course, your mom wouldn't. Your dad was perfectly willing to do it. But, so we brought a number of very successful, important investigations. We tried a case against probably the best lawyer in the 20th century, Edward Bennett Williams. Frank and I together. I would love to say we beat him. I'd love to, but I can't because we didn't beat him. But it was a great experience. And then we were so close that I thought I wanted an academic career, and Frank and Barbara tried to encourage us to consider moving to Madison. And I actually came here and was interviewed and was talking to the people at the law school, but it was the middle of February. A little bit nippy, I mean, minus 20 with the wind chill, and I also had an offer in Miami. So it wasn't a tough choice. So I went and became a full-time law professor. And there's something, and I know you're going to think how unreasonable Frank was about this. So my career as a full-time law professor lasted an entire year. So Frank frequently pointed out that that was less than a distinguished career, lasting only a year, which I think he was unfair about that. But in honor of my 1 year as a full-time law professor, I had a name that Frank and Barbara always called me. Like if I would call and Barbara would answer the phone, she'd say, Frank, it's the dean on the phone. To this day, that's all they called me. So it was wonderful fun. Frank spoke at a bench and bar conference in Miami that I invited him to a few years ago. And after the talk, a woman, about 40 years old, came up and said, I'm an assistant U.S. attorney here in Miami, and I had been the chief assistant U.S. attorney in Miami after, that's why I took a leave of absence from teaching and did that. And I said, oh, thanks for coming to hear me talk. She said, no, I didn't come to hear you talk. She said, I came to hear Professor Tuerkheimer. I said, Professor, you were my law professor. And that's true. Her name is Elin Abramowitz, and she said, you were the best professor I ever had. The one thing Frank taught me in my distinguished academic career, I gave an essay exam. I had about 100 students, I taught 2 courses, and I was deluged with blue books. And night and day for 3 weeks, grading and grading. Frank said to me, you just don't get it. You do multiple choice exams. Then they're graded by the machine, and you can go out sailing, I think he had it right. So on a serious note, Frank's book, Forgotten Trials of the Holocaust, one of those trials is about a case that I tried as the chief prosecutor. The defendant was an officer at Treblinka, which was a death camp. And I gave Frank the transcripts of the trial. And Frank studied those transcripts, and he talked to me from time to time to get a little bit of things that happened, background. And he captured that trial so remarkably that I sent copies of the book to non-lawyers who read it. And they came away with just a sense of absolute horror of life at Treblinka, which was a death camp. They killed 900,000 people in 14 months. So Frank, when he wanted to be, could be a very serious scholar. But before I sit down, I don't want to exaggerate, but virtually every time I spoke to Frank, for 40 years, I don't know how it would come up, but his pride in his children and in his grandchildren, and of course in his bride, there was never a conversation when that didn't come through loud and clear. Now, Frank was the first one to concede when I would say that the true scholar, the true academic, the only real professor was his daughter. I don't think he disputed that. I would say it half teasing, and he would be the first one to agree. And when he told me that, Alan, you went and started your own company, it was just filled with so much pride. So from time to time, I'm on television doing legal commentary. So I would send Frank and Barbara the clips. And I said to Frank once, one of my ventures at being funny, I said to him, you may confuse me with Brad Pitt, the lookalike. Well, most people who I'd say that to would sort of laugh, try and be polite. Frank said, who's Brad Pitt? So he never heard of Johnny Carson. He never heard of Brad Pitt. But I'll tell you what he did hear of and knew his entire life. He knew how to be the very, very best friend, father, grandfather, spouse of anybody that I've ever known. And my mom and dad said that when they pass away, they want written where they're buried. And of course, we honored their wishes. Loving memories last forever. And that's how I feel about Frank. It's only 2 weeks. I think, Barbara, other than family, I was the last person to talk to Frank. And I texted you. He didn't sound good, but it was near the end. But for most of the time, he was so upbeat. He was so courageous. He had so much grace that I don't know what he really felt inside, but he was just a wonderful human being, one of the best I've ever known. And I'm going to believe he's still with us. But I love you all, and Frank is just more than special. So thank you for having me.
not everyone could be here in person today to share memories. So now we would like to provide via video some words by John Vodi.
Good afternoon. I'm John Vodi. I wish I was with all of you today to honor Frank's life. But in a conflict I know Frank would appreciate, Stephanie and I are out of the United States on a trekking adventure. In May 1978, when Frank was the United States Attorney appointed by President Carter, he hired me, a second-year law student, to be his law clerk. I didn't realize it then, but this was a life-changing, career-defining moment. For the next 45 years, Frank was my mentor and my friend. What a blessing he was to me. His calm counsel, his piercing intellect, and his gentle charm will be greatly missed by all of us. Frank had many wonderful qualities, but one close to my heart was his ability to see potential in others they didn't see in themselves. That's what Frank did for me. He saw something in me that I did not see in myself. He believed in me. And then he guided me to achieve things I never thought were possible. He hired me and turned me into a trial attorney. He brought me to the law school to teach evidence and trial advocacy. He supported me in the process of becoming a United States Attorney in 2010 to occupy the same spot he had held previously. When I saw Frank in mid-July, for what turned out to be the final visit, I told him that when he had spoken at my investiture as United States Attorney in October 2010, I simply kept thinking, I'm here because of your vision and your guidance. We should all be blessed to have such a person in our lives. Today we're celebrating a remarkable life, a life of varied facets and accomplishments. Above all, of course, Frank was committed to his faith and to his wonderful family. He was also an esteemed professor, a writer, a teacher. Others will speak to these facets of Frank's life. I want to speak to one other facet. At his core, I believe Frank was a trial lawyer. More specifically, Frank was a prosecutor. This facet of his character informed his teaching and his writing about evidence, trial advocacy, Watergate, the Holocaust. I'm no doubt prejudiced, having been a prosecutor all my career. But I think Frank's special skills as a trial lawyer led to his great success as a teacher and writer. He was brilliant, of course, but that's not enough to be a great trial lawyer. Frank achieved greatness not by working more complexly than others, but by working more simply. Frank went directly to the point, unaffected by all the confusing details where others lose themselves. I saw this daily as his law clerk and then as an assistant United States Attorney after Frank hired me in January 1980. I worked with Frank and saw him build complex environmental and fraud cases. I worked with Frank as he built and then tried the corruption case against a sitting Iron County judge, Alex Rainieri. I worked with Frank as he built and then tried the Joyce bombing case, where a family business blood feud spanning from New York to Illinois to Wisconsin literally exploded with a bombing and a death on a quiet night in August 1977 on a lake at State outside Minocqua. What did I see? What did Frank teach me and so many others? Case organization, assessing each piece of evidence for a trial for admissibility and strength, looking through the confusion, finding the key details in a case, preparing witnesses to tell a full and truthful story, presenting a case to a jury clearly, persuasively arguing a case, and doing all of this with the highest ethics. Knowing the prosecutor's role in protecting the rule of law means making decisions based only on facts. Not who a person is, not who they know, not based on power or money, just follow the facts. That was Frank. And his calling as a prosecutor, a trial lawyer, flowed through to his teaching and his writing. Frank's principles were passed on to me and to all those others fortunate enough to study under and work with Frank. I now pass on Frank's principles every time I teach an advocacy class for prosecutors or defense attorneys in the far corners of the world. That is my part in continuing Frank's magnificent legacy. We will deeply miss our friend, our colleague, our mentor, but we will always treasure his presence in our lives. Thank you, Frank.
We now hear from Sheila Cohen. Oh, I'm sorry. We now hear from Sheila Cohen.
I speak not only for myself today, but for my husband, Mark, very, very close friend of Frank's, and our two adult children, Kimberly and Jeff, who are here today, to not only celebrate their Uncle Frank's life, but to share in our loss and our mourning. Mark first met Frank, Barbara and Frank, in 1970 when they moved to Madison from New York and chose him to be the pediatrician for his their three-month-old baby daughter, Debbie. Shortly after that, I was fortunate enough to meet both of them in this very sanctuary where Barbara and I had come to say Kaddish for our fathers. After the service, we had the opportunity to spend time talking with them and enjoying their company so much that upon leaving, we thought, I think we've spent time with potentially very good friends. And as they say, the rest is history. Certain that many would speak words of well-deserved praise of Frank's intellect, scholarship, friendship, exemplary role as a loving husband and father and granddad. I've decided to speak of that aspect of his persona that John Sayles referred to, and that is his proclivity for the practical joke, often by phone, coupled with an uncanny ability to convincingly disguise his voice in a variety of ways. A dangerous duo for the unsuspecting like me. I'm sure that several gathered here today know of what I speak, including Barbara and Debbie, and probably Alan too. In the early days of our friendship, we happened to mention to Frank that we were anxious to sell our old Buick car. We'd placed an ad in the paper and were very discouraged about the paucity of response. And so, a few days later, the phone rang. When I answered it, a man with a very thick but believable accent identified himself as a very interested buyer of the car that he saw advertised in the paper. However, he explained that he was on his way out of town and would need to pick it up shortly after our conversation. But of course, I will need some very important information about its condition, he said. And then the litany of questions began. I easily answered the first three about the make and the model and the mileage, but then he sprung. When did you last change the crankshaft, he asked. From our previous conversation about the car, Frank readily and rightly realized that I didn't know the difference between a crankshaft and a piston, let alone if it had to ever be changed. Needless to say, there was a long suffering pause on my end of the phone. I was about to lose a prospective buyer. Finally, perhaps out of compassion or just unable to contain his laugh, Frank let me off the proverbial hook. But there were other such calls, like the irate father who yelled at me through the receiver that I had made his daughter very sick by serving her all that junk food at my daughter's 10-year-old birthday party. After getting to know Frank better, I was on to him. No longer such an easy prey. However, he ended up having the ultimate joke in the form of my ongoing suspicion that any caller outside of the immediate circle of friends and family could be Frank. When an actual Chabad rabbi called to entice us to join the fold, before the poor man made it through the second sentence, I blurted out, "Frank." After a split second of what must have been total confusion on the rabbi's part, he recouped his composure and replied in all seriousness, "Yes, I am being very frank." Another fact about Frank that may not be widely known, although Elin alluded to it and actually gave a beautiful poem, like his father used to do, was Frank's penchant and talent for writing long poems, sometimes tomes, which he would recite to a friend or colleague on the occasion of their birthday or other life event. In typical Frank style, he would research and then write the detailed account of the recipient's life history to date, all in rhyme. Our family was fortunate to receive several of Frank's tomes over the years. So Frank, before closing, here's a brief one for you. Your friendship was one that we treasured, enriched as you shared your passions, music, history, geography, the wonders of the night sky. Your interests were unmeasured. Whether we rode our bikes to farmer docks, cruised Lake Michigan on a sunset sail, or paddled the Wisconsin River by canoe, you brought your boundless zest, your love of life, to everything you do. You had a saying that others have referred to today that went like this: you can't rue the passage of time. You could only rue not using it well. You lived by that credo, our friend. A life well spent to the very end.
We invite Bridget Brennan to come to the bema, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Tuerkheimers for inviting me to share my memories. I'm the head of a prosecution office in New York City. Frank was a mentor and a dear friend, and I never would have been what I am today but for Frank. I graduated from UW Law School 40 years ago, and taking a couple of classes from Frank Tuerkheimer changed the course of my life. But more importantly, his wisdom, integrity, and uncompromising standards have affected thousands of law students through his many years of teaching. No one took a class from Frank and forgot him. No one forgot his presence, what it felt like to hear from him. No one forgot the power of his words. There was nobody like him who could make such a deep and lasting impression. And I don't think there are that many people in life that we will meet who will make such a deep and lasting impression, so deep that when we talk about him, we still feel his presence. I'm sure all of you, like me, have really felt his presence today. Sharing memories and hearing stories, I conjure up those intense blue eyes. And the way, remember this, how he bit his bottom lip when he was thinking about something? He was pondering over it. And I picture us, after I was a prosecutor and after I had been in the DA's office for a while and became the head of an agency, sitting at a table in a slightly ragged restaurant near the courthouse in Manhattan, and hearing his stories about his family and his current projects, and me telling him about the challenges I faced. And I remember Frank taking note of his surroundings and telling me about how his father had been a stationery salesman and how sometimes he would take Frank downtown where we were, in the area we were sitting, because there were a lot of offices there back then. And even when he talked to me then, honestly, he had such a way of conveying information, I could actually picture him walking through the streets, holding his father's hand. I see him as deeply engaged, I saw him then, and strategizing with me about limited legal tools that we had to actually achieve justice. We discussed how to hold police officers accountable for injuries to people in their custody and how to protect children too young to be witnesses. And I remember the intense stare, and I hear the intake of breath when he disagreed with one of the strategies I was suggesting. He didn't want to step all over me, but I could tell when I was right and when I was kind of skating it a little bit. But the discussions were always valuable and very concrete because Frank had the ability to communicate more effectively than just about anyone I know. He could paint scenes with his words about his father, as I described, but I don't know, randomly, the thought always occurs to me. He described to me when he was a child, and I think this was when he was up in Washington Heights, which is in northern Manhattan. He rode his bike, I think it was, up towards the top of the Hudson where it's still densely forested, and he put his hands over his eyes like this so he could try to envision it the way the Native Americans did hundreds of years ago. And it created such a picture for me that when I've been up there, I've actually done that myself. But that was the power. That was the power of the man whose life we celebrate today. And he was my professor for criminal litigation and trial advocacy. And I was in my third year, and I knew he had a reputation for being tough and intense, and he was all of that. But in the classroom, he was such a compelling presence and had such a unique background as a high-level prosecutor. And in his class, for the first time, I really thought about all that could be accomplished if legal tools were in the hands of a skilled lawyer committed to a just cause. Frank was provocative, and he didn't accept a superficial answer. He wanted us to understand, as he did, that determining what was right could be the hardest thing of all. And in his classes, the law became tangible, not just theoretical. So during my last semester, Frank left a note for me on the message board, and I went up to talk to him right away. And when we met, Frank, being Frank, got right to the point. And he said to me, "Have you ever considered being an assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office?" Now, being from Wisconsin, never having set foot in New York City, and planning to go back to my job that I had before as a journalist, I had never really considered the possibility, but now I was intrigued. And he called his old boss, Robert Morgenthau, set up interviews for me. 2 weeks later, I was in New York. I had the job, interviews, and met with Mr. Morgenthau, and he offered me the job, which I accepted on the spot. I must admit, I cried all the way back to Wisconsin, thinking, how can I ever live in that city? But, 40 years later, it's worked out for me. I'm profoundly grateful for everything that Frank did for me. But that pales in comparison to what he did for so many other students, what he did for so many other people. His passion for what is right, his focus on bringing all the facts to the conclusion in service of a good cause, that passion is contagious. We all share it here today. But what I'm most thankful for is his continued presence. To this day, I see that steady blue-eyed stare, the pursed lips, the raised eyebrows, and the gestures he always used to make his points more emphatic. I think it was the clenched fists, actually. He always seemed to be asking, what can we do better? What can we do better? And in my life, in my career, that's what I've contemplated. And my guess is, however Frank touched our lives, he's had that same effect on all of us. So I honor his memory, and I'm so glad to be here to celebrate his life with all of you. Thank you.
We would like to invite Dylan Smith, Frank's son-in-law, to join us, please.
Like all great heroes, Frank had an Achilles heel. Superman had kryptonite. Frank had the pink schmendrick. What is a schmendrick? Some of you may be asking, and why pink? Schmendrick is the vaguely Yiddish-sounding term that, as far as I'm aware, Frank coined for the pie-shaped piece of plastic that one attempts to accumulate circling around the board in Trivial Pursuit. And some of you may now be recalling that pink is the entertainment category. And the dean really set me up for this because, I mean, come on, who doesn't know who Johnny Carson is in the 20th century? And for all Frank's vast array of knowledge, not only law, science, history, when it came to pop culture, it was, more of a desert with an occasional oasis of knowledge. And so if you were in a neck-and-neck game of Trivial Pursuit with Frank, and you needed one schmendrick, chances were it was the pink schmendrick. Now, of course, Frank had a strategy to deal with this vulnerability. Confronted with a pink question to which he did not know the answer, you know what I'm going to say, inevitably, Frank would respond, Rod Steiger. Now, if you have an old Trivial Pursuit game at home, you can check me on this. Go rummage through the box. Within the thousands and thousands of questions, there is one to which the correct answer is Rod Steiger. And you can imagine Frank's absolute childish glee and my frustration the one time Rod Steiger was the correct and winning answer. I share that because it makes me happy to think about sitting around Frank and Barbara's kitchen table playing Trivial Pursuit, but also because I think it captures something about Frank that you've already heard about, which is that he was always ready to laugh at himself. And for all of his accomplishments, he just did not have that kind of ego that prevents most of us from finding humor in our misadventures. And Sheila, you were kind to Frank because I think as much as he liked perpetrating a good practical joke, I think he was just as happy to be a victim of a well-crafted practical joke. And most of Frank's stories about himself usually ended in some way with the joke being on Frank. And Frank was a wonderful storyteller. I think it's one of the reasons, in addition to his wisdom and his formidable intelligence, that he was such a wonderful teacher and wonderful trial lawyer. And it may seem a little bit of a paradox, as the rabbi alluded to, that someone who was so present in every moment reveled in stories about the past. But I think for Frank, it was a way he had of collapsing time and of keeping close to him the people and one particular golden retriever who he loved, even when they weren't physically present. Barbara, I didn't know your parents, but because of the way, and Jackie, because of the way Frank talked about your father, Abe, and what a prince of a human being he was, and what a gentle man he was, I feel a connection to him. And I can't think of how many times Frank talked about your family trips to Winmore. This is the retirement community where Barbara and Jackie's mother lived in her later years. And this glint would enter Frank's eye because usually the story revolved around his refusal to bend to the petty tyranny of the community's rules and regulations. And I think that glint would enter his eye not only because he had scored a victory over petty tyranny, but because of the relationship, Barbara, that he had with your mother, and he knew he could cause her that service and still get away with it, maybe just barely sometimes. I did get to meet Frank's older brother, Paul. This is Alan and Deb's uncle, Paul. Paul's son, Michael, is here today with us, which is wonderful. And when I met Paul, by that time, to me, he was a dignified, somewhat reserved older gentleman, but because of the stories Frank told about his childhood, I could see that more daring teenager and young man that Frank looked up to so much, who had been ready to fight the Nazis and who had this almost innate ability with all things electronic that Frank used to marvel at so many years later. And then, of course, there were Frank's parents. And Susan, I think the no nostril flaring thing, I think that had to have a lot to do with Frank's mother. And, you know, as Frank said, on more than one family occasion, she built a home where there was not a lot of money, but there was a lot of love and a lot of laughter. And Frank's father, the namesake of our Max, with whom he shares a birthday, taught Frank that half a job is no job at all. And Bridget alluded to this when young Frank watched his father on these sales calls. He was also very conscious of the fact that his father walked with a wounded leg. And that was a wound he had suffered in World War I in the service of the country from which inexplicably he would need to flee with his family some 20-odd years later. And despite that wound, both physical and psychic, Frank's father persevered with dignity and stubborn determination and without complaint. And I have to believe that when Frank dealt with this awful disease with so much courage, with stubborn determination and without complaint, that the example of his father was never far from his mind. And so I really want to say this to Frank's grandchildren, to Max and Leo and Jacob and Lizzie. Those were Granddad's heroes. Those immigrants, refugees from Nazi Germany, whose life had literally been shattered, who came here with almost nothing and built a life in Washington Heights with a combination of love and laughter and stubborn determination. And because of the stories Granddad told about them, their memory is a blessing. And so now, too, is Granddad's. And because the way you keep him alive in your heart and the stories you tell about him, his memory will be a blessing for years to come. Frank loved to celebrate birthdays, like other members of the Tuerkheimer family. Birthdays are just, they're ratcheted up a notch. It's one thing when you marry into the Tuerkheimer family, in addition to a certain amount of stubbornness, you need to learn to accept. And one manifestation of this, in addition to the wonderful poems that you've heard about, was the singing of the Happy Birthday song. And in the Tuerkheimer family, you don't just sing the part everyone's familiar with, you know, happy birthday to you. There's a coda that is observed with religious regularity, right? It's, and many more. And one manifestation of Frank's just the way he relished birthdays was he would really throw himself into the Happy Birthday song. And whenever we were lucky enough to be together for birthday celebrations, I would find my eyes drifting to Frank because he would get that childlike joy on his face. And I'm going to have to step aside from the podium for a minute, but I think for him the whole point was to get to that coda. And Bridget, you talked about the, fist clenching frustration. This was, the fist, but he would do a little air pump, and many more. And I'm just going to miss that. I'm going to miss it. Well, this last year on the Jewish calendar was it. Obviously, there are not going to be more, and that's hard to accept. It's still hard to wrap our minds around. But if Frank was going to leave us, there really was no more fitting day than on the biggest birthday of them all, having made the absolute most of each and every moment that his allotment was with us.
And I want to invite now to the bema Leo Tuerkheimer Smith.
Everybody who is here today knows that my granddad accomplished great things. Some of these great achievements range from prosecuting the greatest political scandal in our country's history, to influencing many, many students as a professor, to helping write the Constitution of Eswatini. These incredible achievements, however, did not make my granddad a great man. My granddad was a great man because of the unique way that he lived his life. Firstly, he took every day as an opportunity. I don't think I ever saw him waste a single minute worrying or a single minute complaining. He always just lived every single moment to the absolute fullest. I'm sure that everybody who's here knows about his amazing sense of humor. And as we've heard from many speakers today, there was nothing like a granddad practical joke. And as God knows, well, as she was usually the victim, we teamed up for quite a few over the years. I don't think that there was anything better than eliciting a strong laugh and seeing his eyes twinkle. One of my most vivid memories at a very young age took place in this city at 202 Ozark. And I remember that it was a clear night, and I must have been going through a space phase. And the two of us spent a very long while in the living room with the telescope. And it was a very clear night, and we took quite a while just looking at the beautiful night sky. And because I was a young kid, I had a lot of questions to ask, and they were questions of a very simple nature, like, why is the sky blue? Or why can we see Venus, but we can't see Pluto? And I remember very, very vividly the way that he answered the questions with so much joy and patience. And he responded to every question with that signature twinkle in his bright blue eyes. And I got the sense in that moment that both of us were perfectly content. And I think one of the reasons was because he managed to keep his curiosity that so many of us lose as we go from children to adults. And when his curiosity was kindled, his eyes were almost a window into his mind, and you could see his wheels turn, which was truly special. And even though I, like everyone else here, am extremely sad that I have to be up here talking on this day, I'm overwhelmed with another emotion, which is gratitude. As I can see from looking out at everyone who's here today, which is many, many people, my granddad touched so many lives and taught so many people how to live the right way, or as I call it, the granddad way. It brings me immeasurable gratitude, even on a day like today, that I had the privilege of knowing such a special man so closely. I know that he will live on forever in our memories and the way that we live our lives. Thank you.
And Max Tuerkheimer Smith.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to start off by reiterating what Leo said. Just looking out, seeing so many people, many of whom I know, many of whom I just am meeting for the first time today, and just hearing all these stories about how Granddad has touched everyone's lives. It's just, I'm really sad, but it's just an amazing thing. We can all be here. And after this, I just would, like the rabbi said, if anyone just wants to come up to me, whether I know you or not, and tell me stories about what you remember about Granddad, I mean, that would mean the world to me. I would really appreciate that. So I'm Max Tuerkheimer Smith, and like Leo said, I'm filled with gratitude right now. because during the first 18 and a half years of my life, I got to spend abundant time with the extraordinary man we're all here to honor today, and I had the privilege of calling him my granddad. Extraordinary is not a word I use lightly. I can go on and on about Granddad's embodiment of the American dream, remarkable resume, razor-sharp wits, or devotion to his family. And everyone who spoke before me did an amazing job of doing all that. But today I want to talk about something a little bit different. Just like Granddad, I think the expression, may his memory be a blessing, is one of the expressions I love the most from the Jewish religion. And Granddad's memory really is truly a blessing. I wish I could reach out and receive the very same hug that has been proven to break ribs. It makes me really sad knowing that never again in my life will I fear for my safety greeting Granddad during a Madison or New York visit. But I am blessed, truly blessed, with memories. Yellow plastic duck beaks, hibachi at Benihana, a certain employee of Hardigan's ice cream shop, Central Park rocks. I know just looking at a lot of you right now, those words don't mean anything. And I was looking around at like the people who know what I'm talking about. When they come to my mind, and I'm sure when they come to your mind too, they make me smile. And I think of Granddad looking down at me smiling too. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about memory. And I think Granddad, more than most, loved to harness this power of memory. As my dad spoke on through storytelling, he was a remarkable storyteller. And I do too. I think it's in large part due to picking up the trait from Granddad. And so I just want to share two quick stories. A lot of people told stories, and I think it's very fitting. So I'm going to do the same. And one of them is towards the very beginning of my life, one of the very first memories I have, and certainly the first one I have of Granddad. And the second story is the last memory I have of Granddad, the last time I got to hang out with him. I remember, albeit vaguely, the summer I spent in Madison. I was 4 years old, moving from Maine to Illinois, and we stayed with God and Granddad before our new house was ready. God and Granddad bought my brother and Leo and me new bikes. Mine was bright blue, Specialized. One day, Leo and I were out riding our bikes at the bottom of a hill. Granddad filming Leo and simultaneously walking backwards so as to not collide with him. So he was walking like this, He asked God to let him know if he was getting too close to me. I was going this way. I was riding this way. He's coming backing up. And closer and closer we got, and God's a very attentive person. She knew what she was supposed to be doing. And she did say, she said, watch out, he's coming. I don't know, I guess maybe the memo was delivered a little too late or something, but I didn't really know how to bike. I was unsteady off my training wheels, and I completely just fell to the ground. And I was fine, but a little distraught. Granddad fell down too. I should have checked to see if he was okay, but that wasn't my reaction. "You broke my bike!" I screamed. The recording was still going. "You broke my bike!" I was really mad. Rest assured, the bike wasn't broken. Jacob, I'm pretty sure that's your bike now, or at one point it was your bike. You can confirm it's still working, right? Yeah? Okay, good. Yeah. And that story reminds me, when I think of it, I think of Granddad's love of the outdoors. We spent countless hours biking together. Yeah, I think about him a lot, but when I'm on the bike, it's different because I actually feel him with me when I'm on the bike. I've been to Madison to visit God and Granddad many times since then, and my second story comes from my most recent visit, which, like I said earlier, was the last time I saw Granddad. Granddad was a fighter 2 years after a pancreatic cancer diagnosis, after continued grueling treatment that attacked his body along with his cancer. He was still looking for ways to enjoy life. 1 week before he passed, Granddad sat behind the computer and did what he loved doing, He taught. He taught about Watergate for 2 hours. I was there, I was watching. He was brilliant, engaging, he was humorous. All the things everyone talked about earlier today. I want everyone here to know that even at the tail end of his life, the very end, Granddad never lost those razor-sharp wits I was talking about earlier. That's for sure. The night before that class, God went out to dinner with friends, so I had a night with Granddad. We talked for hours, and I can say for certain that I will never forget that conversation. He shared so much wisdom with me that I'm committed to passing down from generation to generation. Another one of Granddad's favorite sayings is in Hebrew, Ledor V'dor. It means from generation to generation. And as my dad was talking about, I believe that it is my responsibility and Leo's, Jacob's, Lizzie's responsibility. We're going to live up to it. We're going to spread these memories from generation to generation. But most importantly, during this visit, Granddad schooled me in Yahtzee. And I mean, I think this is kind of similar to the whole pop culture thing, but he didn't know how to play Yahtzee. I had to remind him how to play Yahtzee, and he still beat me. Yeah, I wish I could say it was close. It really wasn't. And up until the very end, Granddad found the pleasure in life, doing the things he loved. He taught his students over Zoom and me over dinner. He played a game. Think about what he was going through, and yet he still made the most of the time he had. I think we can all take a page from Granddad's book. When I hugged Granddad goodbye for the last time, just a few days away from heading out to college, I was hopeful, just like Granddad. I was optimistic, just like Granddad. But I also knew that there was a chance it would be the last time I saw Granddad. And it was. But all I can say is that I am so, so blessed that the last visit was such a meaningful one. Granddad, I'll remember it always. I love you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Members of this congregation this afternoon have heard that it was special that Frank passed away on Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of a new year. People who that happens to, we call tzaddikim, we call them righteous ones. And the reason we do that is because the lore of our people says that at the beginning of the year, your fate is sealed for the whole year, meaning you don't really know what's going to happen to you. And if you make it through the whole year, you must have been a really righteous person. And Frank did that for the past year. Frank liked righteous people. Frank loved righteous people. And one of the righteous people that I want to talk about for 2 seconds right now is a man by the name of Arturo Toscanini. Arturo Toscanini, for those of you who may not know, was a conductor of music. He worked at the New York Philharmonic, and I think before that at La Scala in Rome. He was a gifted composer. And he was so gifted that he made quite a splash at the Bayreuth Festival in Germany, and Adolf Hitler invited him back to do that. But by that time, Adolf Hitler had become chancellor of the country, and everyone, especially the tzaddikim among us, the righteous ones, saw the pathway ahead. And Toscanini refused. It is in my mind, he said, it is my duty, said Toscanini, to fight for the cause of artists who are persecuted by the Nazis. And this world-famous musician was equally outraged at Mussolini's fascist dictatorship as well. It was Frank's wish that we hear this piece of music right now. This piece of music is a little snippet from a piece of music that was mentioned earlier today. It's from the Dvorak's From the New World Symphony. It's from Largo, which is the second movement, and it's a piece that Barbara is so pleased that we're beginning to offer, and that Frank, too, had wished to hear. So as we offer our own silent contemplations and we call to mind the memories that each of us has about Frank, that happens perhaps during this period of contemplation as we hear this music of Anton Dvorak and From the New World. Toscanini recorded that back in the late 1940s, and you can always buy new recordings of that as well. We now ask the community, with all of these memories in our minds, we invite the community to rise as we offer El Malei Rachamim, a prayer of memory for Frank, as we pray for God to take Frank under the wings of eternity and protect him.
El Malei Rachamim Shochein B'meromim Hamitzei Menucha Nichona תחת כנפי השכינה, עם קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. את נשמת יששכר בן מרדכי ורחל, שהלך לעולמו, בעל הרחמים יסירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר
O God, full of compassion, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence, along with all the righteous and holy ones, to Frank Tuerkheimer, our loved one who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge forever in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And we say, Amen. Amen. Please join one another, for those who know, with the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divara chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon, u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imeru Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen. May God send peace to all who mourn and remember at this time. And we say Amen.
Amen.
The congregation may be seated. The service concludes, and please stay with us for a little while out in the Weinstein Community Court for a small meal of condolence, and be sure to greet Frank's family.